issues. We've been planning this particular topic for a while. And then, of course, disruptions with the pandemic. So it seemed like a great opportunity, given the cultural moment, to put this together. And I want to begin with the land acknowledgement from where I'm based. Currently, I'm at home in Kitchener, although I work at Trent University up in Peterborough, and I'm the co-chair of CAUT's Equity Committee. So I'm based in Kitchener. So in Kitchener, we acknowledge that we're on the land of the Haudenosaunee Tract, land promised to the people of Haudenosaunee either side of the Grand River. And this territory is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I think land acknowledgements are a reminder of actions we can take to try to let people think about and reflect upon systemic racism, which is the topic of today's panel. We have three speakers. I will give you a more detailed introduction to the speakers as we go along, but just to let you know the structure. First, we'll have Dr. Francis Henry, who's Professor Emerita from York University in Ontario. And then our second speaker is Yala Sangari, who's an associate professor at St. Anne in Nova Scotia. And Yala is also the outgoing treasurer of CAUT. And then finally, we have Zara Gamal Joseph, who's based at BCIT in British Columbia. I'll give you a bit more detail once the speakers begin. We're going to try to keep everybody to 5 to 7 minutes so that there's enough time for a good Q&A. That's always a little bit difficult, but I think there's going to be a good opportunity for discussions and questions. So we just ask the speakers to remember the timekeeping. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A, and you're able to put questions into the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and then those will get filtered through to me. So today, I'm really happy that we're doing this. It's a space really to talk about experiences of systemic racism, but also I think given what's been going on globally, but particularly in North America recently, there's a cultural moment in which groups outside of minority or equity seeking or oppressed groups are being asked to think about their position in relationship to this issue. And universities are not immune to that social system of biases. So really today, I think, we can listen, we can learn, and also importantly, I think we can start to work through what actions we can take to actually practically and permanently challenge these kinds of issues in our workplaces and hopefully in our wider societies as well. So again, welcome everybody, and we're going to begin with Dr. Francis Henry. Dr. Henry is a pioneer in studies of racialization in Canada, and particularly more recently in the academy. She's Professor Emerita from York University, and the most recent book co-authored with a number of colleagues, I think some of whom are probably here on the call as well, so it'll be great to draw upon their expertise as well. And that book is The Equity Myth, published by UBC Press. So I'm going to hand it straight over to Francis Henry, and we'll start with her talk. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your introduction. I'm not going to be speaking about my recent co-authored book, The Equity Myth, because I've become very concerned with the confluence of the COVID pandemic and the effect it has on racialized people throughout the world. So I'm going to make a few brief comments on that subject. I think what we've seen in the last few months is the force of both structural racism and a worldwide health pandemic in which racialized peoples are at far greater risk of infection and death than our white populations. Roughly 42% of the deaths in the US are Blacks, who are 21% of the population. There are infections and deaths in other ethnic communities in line with their demographics, although there are many hot spots, particularly in the United States, with Hispanic peoples. The Hispanic population, for example, is 17%, and the Black population in the state of Illinois is 14%. Yet here we have a figure that 63% of virus cases are amongst those two groups. In the UK, recent evidence suggests that Bangladeshi people are twice, Pakistani people 3 times, and Black African peoples almost 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white British people, and with a higher rate of death among Indian, Black Caribbean, and other ethnic groups. The data also shows that Black people are between 2 and 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with the coronavirus than white people. And of course, death rates are higher. Now, even in Canada, where we do not collect statistics and therefore can't race-based statistics, and we can't make any assertions really at this point, but in the area of London, they collected statistics recently and found that is London, Ontario, I must make myself clear. They found that the COVID was 3 times higher than where there were racialized communities in and around the city of London. Pandemic studies here should have showed higher rates for Asian and Black population groups as well, but we don't have the statistics to prove that. Now, the factors that are involved in this incredible difference are, for example, occupational overrepresentation in frontline health works, staffs of nursing homes, care centers, caregivers. Basically, what we're looking at is a working population of poor immigrant people in poor jobs. They cannot telecommute, but they have to use public transportation, and they are in poor paying jobs. Many of them are themselves in poor health with underlying health conditions. There is, of course, the specter of poverty. Living in poverty means having to go to work. They do not have the luxury of staying at home. And living in public housing, where there is less space for living and for keeping distances. And there is, of course, the general inability to keep up with the safety measures. In earlier pandemics, for which we have some statistics, for example, Indigenous people, even in Canada, living in poverty, had higher infection rates in earlier pandemics. What we have basically is racism, but not race. In the absence of any genetic link between racial groups and susceptibility to the virus, we are left with the reality, which seems difficult to accept, that these groups are suffering more from how our societies are organized, not because of their racial or genetic status. There is no clear evidence that higher levels of medical conditions such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and weakened immune systems in disadvantaged communities are because of inherent genetic characteristics, nor is there any real evidence that sociological or cultural explanations are particularly useful. There is evidence, however, that there is structural racism. All these underlying problems can be directly connected to the food and the exercise you have access to the level of education that you were able to achieve, your employment, your housing, your healthcare, your economic and political power within various communities. The evidence suggests that the coronavirus itself does not discriminate, but what it does do is highlight existing discriminations. The continued prevalence of ideas about race today, despite the lack of any scientific basis, shows that these ideas can mutate to provide justification for the power structures that have ordered our society since the 18th century. So in conclusion, let me just note that the COVID pandemic and the ensuing crisis it has provoked opens up the cracks that are already evident in society's structures and institutions, including, of course, the university. It also reinforces them by making already evident disadvantages worse. Structures of inequality are brought into sharp relief, as, for example, the example of the nursing home staffs consisting of underpaid, already poor, often immigrant women. The relationship between people and its consequent health effects are more sharply experienced and lead to overcrowding. And undercutting all of these issues is the always present specter of capitalist expansion and the neoliberal world we are now living in, which divides into ever greater swaths of the poor and the ultra rich, and the consequent decrease in the middle class and its life standards, and the huge role that poverty plays in defining social structure and policy in modern nation states. If I have a minute left, I'd like to provide just one example from an interesting country, France. A lot of work has been done on this subject in France. And I want to quote very quickly a Frenchman, a French African, who says, "It was the shock that I needed to finally wake up. White privilege is real. Whites have access to employment. They're not stopped by the police. They don't have to worry about what they're wearing or if they have their ID cards. But we as Blacks have to worry every day." He was born in the Cameroon, this individual, a former French colony, and he lives in a sprawling housing complex just northeast of Paris. And he says, people look at us suspiciously. They ask us what we're doing. And when I take public transportation, I have to show what's in my backpack. It's not right to have to live like that. And in the wake of Mr. Floyd's killing, these agonizing reflections on race have spread far beyond the United States. In France, they have set off an unexpected reckoning in a country that has long sought social justice through a commitment to universal ideals like equality and secularism, arguing that an emphasis on diversity, ethnicity, or race would undermine unity and the social fabric. So here we have, in essence, the confluence of not only the health situation, but the effects and the protests that came as a result all over the world, which included large numbers of white protesters on the Floyd murder in the United States. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frances. So we'll save the Q&A to the end, as I said. So we're going to move straight into the next speaker. The next speaker is Yala Sangari, who's an associate professor at the University of Santa Ana in Nova Scotia, and he's chair of the Department of Business there, and he's also a very valued colleague on CAUT executive as the treasurer, and has been involved in his faculty association at the local level as well. So I'm going to hand right over to Yala.
Thank you very much, Mormon. So I would like to thank people behind this the scene that makes this event possible. I'm going to talk very quickly about two things and then we can have discussion. I'm going to talk about why I think the progress has been slow and what are possible solutions to fight systemic racism. I have to say I received few emails yesterday and this morning and some saying, you know, CUT is part of a colonial system. Other saying there is no systemic racism, etc., etc. It reminds me when we were undergraduate students in political science, we have Leninists, Marxists, Leninists, Trotskyists, all of us having debate. But I do think we should focus on the racism issue, and it is important and it's urgent. And I also have to say, when I was preparing this presentation or this town hall, there was a kind of fatigues because I was saying, well, in 2020, we're still talking about what should we do, what can we do, etc., etc. So there is a kind of fatigue, but we will keep fighting. So first of all, I have to say, why is it important? Why is it EDI is important? I think there is different reasons. The first reason is I think academic staff should reflect the student population. If you go in any big city in Canada, you can see it's a diverse city. And if you go in any universities, you will see that you don't see those who are teaching doesn't reflect really what you see in the population. I think also students should have access to different voices, to different experience. I was born in Europe. I grew up in Africa and in the Caribbean. I studied in Canada. I think I have a different experience than somebody that is born in Vancouver and Montreal and grew up here. So for students, it will make them a better citizen to have access to that different experience that is not better and worse, but it is different. Coming from a business school, I also think that there is an economic cost when a society is not using all his talent, all his potential. There is a cost there. But there is also even, there is a hidden cost also to racism, you know, that we don't talk about. People that face racism and discrimination days in and days out, you have depression, burnout, low self-esteem, etc., etc. There is an economic cost there also. So I'm going to, why do I think very quickly that the progress has been slow? There is different reasons, but I think, first of all, you cannot help people if you don't listen to them. You have all kind of policy about equity and diversity, etc. But listen to people that live that I think that will be a good starting point. They know their reality, we know our reality. How is it to be scared by a police? How is it to be scared by a security guard on your own campuses, etc., etc. So I think listening will be a good starting point. I think for a lot of administration across the country, they pay only a lip services to EDI. Okay, they all have nice statements and policies about EDI, and some even have office, vice president, president, etc., about the subject. But I think the implementation is not there. It is not enough to have a policy. You have to implement, and we need a leadership, and even more than leadership, we need a kind of voluntarism there. I think a lot of board of governors in our institution fail also to do their jobs on this issue, on the racism issue, on EDI issue. They just fail. And that is not surprising because the board themselves, if you take the majority of board, they are not diverse enough. So they cannot deal with that issue if the board himself is not diverse enough. And I would like to take one sensitive and sensible issue. I think EDI is not very important for a lot of our own local association. You know, I know you have all kinds of associations across the country, so I have to be careful. But when I talk with my colleagues across the country, a lot of them, they don't seem welcome to their own local association. So I think we have work to do on the ground before going to provincial level or national level at CAUT. I think at our local level, we should open the gates to our own members, to minorities. And the problems are everywhere at the recruitment process, at the selection process. Who can have an interview, at the socialization, retention, promotion, evaluation. I have a message that I only have 1 minute, so I think during the discussion period, there are solutions. I think we will discuss about solution, but I have to say, one of the most important solutions is also to be courageous, to really stand up and fight, because this is important. We can have policy statement. I think we should stand up. There is other solution, but I'm going to stop here, and I hope we will have a nice discussion about the possible solution and the pragmatical solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yala. And I think, that's a great point on which to end. Like, we need to think about practical things that we can do. And as I said, there's some other people, I think, on the call who are in positions of leadership and have experience. So hopefully we can hear from them as well. Our last speaker today is Zara. Zara is a valued colleague on the CAUT's Equity Committee and the Aboriginal Working Group. Zara Derek Gamal Joseph is of Dakhel and Class 10 First Nation and Irish descent. Zara's been an advisor at the BCIT Institute in British Columbia for the Indigenous Services Department. And most importantly, recently helped to develop and launch the Indigenous vision for the Institute in May 2019. So I'm going to hand over to Zara right now.
Thank you, Momin. Hari Dianto, Swendo, Zara Derek Gamal Joseph, Lasuzi, Lemetsu. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to also recognize my pronouns, he and him, and just to stand and acknowledge all of those voices and people that are out there around, the Floyd and Chantel and other Indigenous and racialized people within our communities. And in my language, Silbayan is the eagle. And I think of my parents who have passed on as residential school survivors, but are with me now. I brought these a few eagle feathers together to honor them. A stepmom who recently passed of cancer. I thank her and family for guiding me today. And Nad Dene is our ancestors are always with us. Looking at, a few things, residential school and the education system itself. My dad was a residential school survivor, and he always mentioned to me where he had to work 10 times harder. And my question back was why, right? He was removed from his community, his home in Middle River, and taken into a residential school in Northern BC. And because he was a heavier set and bigger guy, he was actually shoveling coal in the basement to heat the building. And he then moved on because he developed TB and was moved into a home of the hospital side. And, it went from priests to then nuns. So he saw the white and the clothing that was being worn. And he saw those nuns as saviors. And when I heard those sharings, I really broke down, because looking at the history of residential school, it really is, the basis of systemic racism for Indigenous people, and how intergenerational trauma has really affected our lives as people moving into the education system and just in life as general. Looking at the education system in general, like I had a BCIT, through some of my research in the past, I had a BCIT Indigenous student share with me about, the belief in life, and even the rocks, their forms of life, the trees, everything around us. That's what we are giving back to and taking when we're praying. You know, when we have deer meat, it's because a young deer has presented themselves to us as sacrifice. That's where we have to thank Mother Earth for all that she offers, and the fish and their cycles of life, and how they come back and present themselves as food. These are all things. I saw a little a question in the chat from the other Francis that, you know, around this is how our post-secondary secondary institutes need to continue to ask, what is the best model to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into planning, curriculum, and student support to address systemic racism. You know, my dad, when he was taken from residential school, he shared this with me later on in my life. So, you know, he shared this with different forms of humor and different forms of other things, and looking at, again, the shock that I felt in my own life about how someone could be, you know, humorous about this. I started to understand that in the corners and the darkest of times, my father and my family and my other relatives that have gone through the schools, we're looking at finding hope in an absolute dark room. And what were they grabbing onto to find this hope, right, within a systemic system, which was at that time was, in my mind, was taking education away. Looking at over the years that anger developed inside of me, and, you know, why the intent to assimilate children and remove the Indian from the child was developed through white culture and through education and brainwashing. That really weighed on me, and looking at how I, in my own life, was always running from this trauma in my life. You know, it took me a long time to stop running and to see what was happening, you know, and authors such as, you know, Sheila Koti Meek, right, look at a double bind is created by not speaking about the psychological trauma related to colonial oppression and racism. We minimize our own experiences by not speaking about them. So for me, when I began to speak about them, I started to let things out, and I started to realize that there was the decolonization process happening for me. You know, Momin mentioned my name, and, you know, I was teased as Zara when I was young by the white kids in kindergarten, and came home and said, "No more Zara, mommy." So I went for the next 30 years of my life as my second name, Derek, because that fit in more to society. So looking at these turning points with me and fundamentally changing the meaning of my experiences and shifting my identity, I naturally soaked in, of course, the environment here in Vancouver, and recognizing the Coast Salish territory. Sorry, I was whipping by with time there, but I guess on the territory here of the Coast Salish people, and soaking in the surroundings here. I was getting to, you know, I began to understand, you know, myself, and look at academic knowledge and new perspectives of knowledge, which I learned from up north. So over time, the feeling of, you know, the racism that I've experienced in elementary and high school, or my undergrad or my grad studies in different workplaces, I began to decolonize myself. You know, I reminded myself that I was taught mainly a Western way that was foreign to my mom and my dad, and others in my Dakelth Northern BC community. I struggled a lot as a student, you know, being stuck in things like a thesis template where I wanted to share my community's oral voice and narrative. And it took me years to understand that Indigenous, my self-expressions, was actually the teachings that I was really searching for in my own life. And I've heard this from other students as well throughout and family members throughout my journey. So looking at post-secondary and institutions that we work within, how are we seeing ourselves as Indigenous people reflected in post-sec? I look at that as a sense of belonging, and creating that sense of belonging. And how do we create an open and safe space where employees, students are open to express ourselves, and allowing our students to express ourselves as Indigenous people, and allowing that vent or that frustration to arise, but also create a dialogue, which is important. You know, as Dr. Henry mentioned about COVID, this has exposed such a huge fact, but the fact for me is that human connection is needed more now than ever. You know, physical, spiritual, mental, emotional. We see these human emotions, and we tend to shut down and suppress and ignore these, when we should be doing the opposite, as such as today is dialoguing around the reality that we have of racism in Canada and around the world. A few approaches, and I'll end with this. I think it's probably getting close to time. is just the different projects and approaches I've taken. I've mentioned a little bit about the Indigenous student perspective and so some of the research work. And you know, the 10 students that I looked at were First Nation status, and I talked about their journey from home to community, and all 10 had intergenerational trauma from residential school. And those are students that are in our classrooms today. We really have to remember that this history of systemic racism and the effects that it has on our families as Indigenous people does exist in the classroom today. What was also mentioned, you know, the amazing team, and when I mentioned Eagle, you'll see behind me there's an Eagle design, the amazing team that I work with at BCIT who have created the Indigenous vision, and that's Corey Wilson and Tammy Pierce and Celeste Dunstan and Alf Dumont and Leah Falstead and our elders, as well our elder Mary Roberts and Blair Goodwill, and looking at priorities for actions. So inclusion actions are people focused. This is what's within our Indigenous vision. You know, intent of building awareness and understanding around the TRC calls to action, around indigenization, around the legacy of colonization, and the contemporary reality of Canada and Indigenous people. Taking accountability and relationship actions as well, and fostering a culture of respect. Of course, the faculty and staff is another prong with this. So looking at ways that we're developing an equity policy and incorporating the TRC calls to action into the equity initiatives that we run within our associations. I'm very proud of the Diversity Circles project that was piloted and approved with a SHIRT grant now quite a while back. And looking at a series of EDI workshops, we're inviting BCIT community into to discuss systemic racism, supporting equity-seeking groups, and you know, developing and working with Indigenous academics to create an Indigenous framework, which is built around expressing ourselves and our relation to our communities and to Mother Earth as well. And then, you know, leading off with the great work that the CAUT Equity Committee, or ending off with the great work that the CAUT Equity Committee is doing. And I think that the big thing that, you know, with indigenization piece with it, which falls into this, is looking at like, how are we using our Indigenous knowledge and traditional practices, such as traditional gifting, the nation-to-nation gifting that was taking place amongst our nations within BC. We have over 200, and there was interaction that was happening. The moose hide was transferred down to other communities, and say baskets would be presented and there'd be gift sharing. And how do we look at that within community to community? So with racialized people with Indigenous populations, and that would bring in and draw more attention to the great things that are happening, the strengths that we're developing within our communities. I'll leave it at that because I could blab on for a while. I hope that sort of fits into the overall piece. I look forward to discussion, and thanks. Masicho.
Thank you so much. That was very moving and very brave, I think, of you to share those personal experiences and to draw us into that and to, you know, ask us to think about that. There actually are a couple of questions directly related to, you know, what you've just spoken about. Do you feel ready to take a couple of questions now, or do you want to have a quick break from that? Is that?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a couple of related questions. You've mentioned, I think, already that the TRC kind of gave some impetus to the work that you were doing both in the community and the campus. So the questions are basically what kind of impact has the TRC had on communities, but also what does that process of decolonization then look like on campus? And obviously you've got a direct experience of, launching that Indigenous vision policy. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that for us.
I think the main thing to remember, and we had a great, looking at titles such as The Seven Fallen Feathers, which was recently a book club topic. And in this huge inquiry that happened within Thunder Bay, the one underlying factor that was happening within all the cases was the fact that there was systemic racism happening within the communities. And the young people within that, even before, in this case, even before they got into the elementary schools, and we do see this within post-secondaries, there'd be pelting of eggs, there'd be racism being thrown at them, there'd be naming and shaming and stuff at these young people. we have to remember that these are things that happen on a regular basis for our students coming into our institutions. And when you talk about equity, it really is that imbalance of how students come into our environments. So to answer the question about how directly the TRC, I think we have to start by really being clear on the where our Indigenous people are within the equity spectrum and go from there. I think it's great to see it all incorporated into our different, like we're guided by, a great leader within our institute, great leaders, and they are incorporated in many different ways. So there is movement. But I think just that core piece around systemic racism is that we have to remember that the students coming in are coming in on a different level.
That's great, Zara. Thanks very much. I'm going to go back to some earlier questions now, which maybe some of the other panelists can address. There's an important kind of organizational one that maybe I can talk a little bit about as well. So the question is that in some local unions, there's a hesitancy in creating a Black, Indigenous, and people of color committee, or perhaps Indigenous committee, Black and people of color committee, in terms of wanting to have it all grouped under one organization, including women and queer groups, so all equity seeking groups. But there's an issue there of like, well, if you do that, you bring all the equity seeking groups together, how do you manage to focus specifically on issues around racialized people? So I think I'll just comment a little bit about that first. I'm based at Trent University in Peterborough. We're small. We have only recently begun an equity committee. And just because of our numbers, and particularly because of the underrepresentation of racialized staff and Indigenous staff, the committee is really taking its remit as all of the equity seeking groups. Within that, one of the strategies we're thinking about developing is to try to establish some forum for the particular equity seeking group. So Black staff, for example, and maybe use that forum to draw people into activism and see if there's enough interest in enough people to constitute a whole separate group, or at least learn from the experiences of the few members of that group that we have. It's difficult. A recent report by Universities Canada also actually acknowledged that difficulty, with university administrators saying, well, there's a geographical and regional difference in the numbers of people that you just have ended up having, and I guess a size difference. So I think it's important to have a debate in your local association about what is practically feasible in terms of setting up an equity committee, and perhaps start that process. And as the committee does some actual work, perhaps then you'll see that there's an appetite for and a motivation to include or to actually create separate groups. But I guess the key point is, and this kind of relates to what Zara was talking about, is that, and Yala as well, that we aren't going to learn how to do things to improve the situation of equity seeking groups until we actually listen to their experiences of being in the workplace or being in the university, because people from equity seeking groups have different experiences of navigating that everyday life and the career from the mainstream group. So whichever way a local association can do that, I think is important to begin. And if that begins with a more general, all-encompassing committee, that's still, I think, a good start. Does anybody else want to chime in on that specific organizational point?
I will make a very quick comment. I think, yes, I'm a little bit nervous when we start talking about Black, First Nation, etc. I think we should fight together. Some issues are specific, but I do think solidarity is really important if there is injustice against First Nation, there is injustice against me, and vice versa. I think, yes, size matter here, some of the biggest university versus my smallest, but I think we should go with solidarity and just fight racism wherever it came from. Thanks.
Can I get into this as well?
Absolutely, Francis, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to have to disagree with the previous speaker. I think what you said earlier is important. Different groups have different experiences, and collecting them all under one umbrella, so to speak, I think does not serve them well. And we have, I'll refer to the equity myth here. We did a lot of research on this for that project, and it's quite clear that the way in which systemic racism at the university affects groups differs from group to group based on their racial status or their ethnicity. And so it seems to me that while I would uphold the notion, of course, of let's fight it together with togetherness, I don't think that's the way to go at university at this point. But a collective EDI with smaller subunits based upon individual groupings, I think would probably, and does work in some instances quite well, because they have organized themselves in any case. So that having a few under one umbrella would perhaps serve the university so that they don't have to duplicate resources and facilities. But at a certain point, there has to be separation.
Yeah, and that, yeah, I mean, you know, that's at some level back to this organizational point, right? Like if you have, you know, the ability and the numbers effectively, and also the energy, you know, from specific groups to do that. But for example, at my university, we couldn't have a committee that was for Black staff, because there would be one person in it from social sciences and humanities. So there becomes this kind of like, you know, difficult transition period of like, well, how do we increase, how do we argue for the increase in, you know, the representation of particular groups? This still brings us on quite nicely to a specific question here about, you know, Black staff at faculty and staff at, and students as well at universities. That you know, it's very difficult to first of all get any relief from the racism which has sort of become normalized on campus, and we see this in the profiling of you know, Black students. That you know, we've seen examples of that over the last couple of years, and the fact that there's you know, there aren't any racialized staff, and particularly Black staff, in positions of leadership that could make a change. And this is one I kind of was going to back to you a little bit, Francis, because there were aspects of the equity myth that talked about that. And I don't know if Melinda is on the call and if she wants to comment on that, but perhaps, Francis, we could begin with you about the leadership issue. Like how do we achieve that transformation when, you know, it's leadership that actually sets the tone for a lot of culture and practices at universities. And it's something, you know, I find very difficult in my own university. There's not a single senior person who does, from chair level above, there's only two of us that are racialized, and one is chair of Indigenous Studies, and there's me.
Well, one finding out of the research from the equity myth is that leadership is probably the most important variable in any structure, including the university. But what we found is that universities that had presidents who were either racialized in some instances, but in many instances who were not racialized, but who provided powerful, strong leadership towards equity initiatives and support for racialized staff, were the most successful in setting out programs and policies and implementing them to a considerable extent. So that leadership from the top is absolutely crucial, and which makes it very important that search committees, when they are recommending individuals for presidents and provosts of universities, must be very, very scrupulous, because the evidence indicates that unless they are committed, fully committed to equity and EDI, nothing much is going to change.
Thanks, Francis. So we actually only have a couple of minutes left. There are a couple of comments about resources. So I just want to say something about that as co-chair of CAUT Equity Committee. We have been in process of developing some resources through the Equity Toolkit. The pandemic has affected the rollout of that, as it's affected everything else. So resources for kind of explaining you know, how to think about systemic racism or institutional racism, institutional biases. So we're preparing some resources like, you know, short explainers, but also links to good other resources will help you to navigate that and understand that. And then also, how does that affect the different stages of what actually happens in the university, and particularly around recruitment and hiring. So we're producing kind of, you know, short action plans focused on each particular stage, and also trying to explain how that fits into the kind of overall pattern. Again, you know, we're hoping that those resources will be out in the fall at some point, and then we'll get to refine them, develop them as we hear from our local associations about specific issues or nuances that perhaps we can't take into account with those kinds of more general resources. And also that there will be links there to explain what these concepts are. We're not, however, in a period in which we are, in a sense, having to debate or question issues like institutional racism. Funding councils, university managements, the CRC have all kind of accepted that these biases exist. And I think a lot of that is down to the great work of people like Francis Henry and union activists that we have on the panel, and other people who've joined us. I think right now we're in a period in which we're trying to work out, you know, what actual specific actions can we build and can we take to transform the institutions that we work in. So I think with that, I'm going to leave it a last word to any of the panelists that they want, but we really have like 30 seconds. Does anybody want to say anything in conclusion? Okay, I'm being told I can't do that. Sorry, I'm excluding you. Okay, so thanks everyone for participating. We're going to move to the French panel now, and thanks again for attending. Thank you very much to our speakers for great illuminating and concise talks as well. And hopefully we can take some energy from this and some positivity that, you know, we're in a period where we're going to start to try to make change. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.